Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning. This is Easter, and the message of Easter is Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Yes, he has. And we have then the story in Mark of the resurrection, and we're going to be surprised by it because it's very different than the other three. And our lesson's entitled Resurrection Faith. The whole quarter's spent on the idea of Christian faith.
Yes. And this is a great title because we do, all of us, come to the resurrection with faith, in faith, and just as the original participants did as well.
Well, last Sunday we were dealing with the denial of Peter.
Yeah, and Peter is going to make an interesting reappearance by name in our text today. It might help to remember that according to early Christian tradition, reliable Christian tradition, the Gospel of Mark was Mark's record of what Peter customarily preached and taught about Jesus. And so we have Peter's memories here, or as Papias called it, the Memoirs of Peter.
All right, now we really need to put, I think, the Gospel of Mark into a kind of a historical setting at this point to kind of grasp why we have in the Gospel of Mark what we have. It's in many ways very cryptic.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things that help us understand the way the Gospel ends. One way to approach that is to remember how the Gospel begins.
Right.
The Gospel begins...
It is different from Matthew and Luke.
The Gospel, and John.
Yes.
The Gospel begins suddenly. We don't get any warm-up. We don't get any birth stories. We don't get anything from his youth. We don't get anything like in the Gospel of John.
A theological...
Thinking about who Jesus is in his pre-existence. It just goes boom. John comes out of the wilderness and starts preaching this powerful message.
Right.
And Jesus shows up and gets baptized. And it just starts suddenly and powerfully. Because Mark is writing to Romans who
are interested in events.
They're not interested in warm fuzzy stuff, and they're not interested in theology and philosophy. What happened? Get cut right to the core of it. And so the gospel begins suddenly.
There's an introductory verse, isn't there? Just a
title. It's a title, actually.
Okay.
Yes. And it focuses on the power of Jesus, calling him the Son of God. And then boom, he appears. And the gospel ends just that suddenly. So we shouldn't be surprised that the gospel ends suddenly.
In other words, it begins suddenly, it moves rapidly through the storyline, and it ends suddenly.
Right.
And it leaves us hanging in a way, we're going to see.
It does. But for good reason, because the gospel focuses on the miracles of Jesus. And the resurrection,
power of Jesus.
The power of Jesus.
Yes,
and the resurrection is the most amazing display of his power and the climactic resurrection. But along the way, the question is, who is Jesus and how do we know he's the Son of God? And interestingly enough, although Jesus does all these miracles, he tells people not to identify him on the basis of his miracles.
As a miracle worker. As simply a miracle worker.
As simply a miracle worker.
Yeah.
And the climax of the gospel is at the foot of the cross. Jesus has just died. A Roman centurion, remember, Mark is writing for Romans.
Right.
When he writes this
writing
gospel.
in Rome, probably.
In Rome, probably. At the foot of the cross, a Roman centurion looks up at the just expired body of Jesus and says, oh, now I get it. This man is the Son of God.
And that's without benefit of the resurrection.
Right.
The way he died.
We saw how he died.
It says this is no ordinary man.
Yeah. So that is the climactic moment. It's followed then by our passage today. Now, we probably should make note of the fact that all of our Bibles have added verses that have been put in.
Following where our printed text
right.
stops.
Right. And our printed text stops where we think, where we're very sure that the Gospel of Mark originally stopped. That is at the end of verse 8. And we know that because the very oldest and very best manuscripts of the New Testament, of the Gospel of Mark, end at verse 8.
Now, why does it end there? Did soldiers come in and arrest Mark just at this point, and so he had to put down his pen and go?
Some people think that, or maybe he wrote more, but it got ripped off the end of the scroll by accident or something. But I think the way Mark ends this gospel in verse 8 is the perfect ending. For one thing, it gives closure to this powerful gospel, which has a precipitous beginning and a precipitous ending. It declares the fact of the resurrection without taking any of the focus off the crucifixion. It's a great ending. But the other reason it's such a great ending is its very openness. It doesn't tie up all the loose ends, and that forces the reader into an interesting position.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, our old King James Bibles have more verses. And where do they come from?
Later manuscripts do include some of these later verses, and so they are in some of the later manuscripts. We assume that they were added fairly early on to the Gospel of Mark by people who wanted to put a little addendum on to show people what Jesus did.
Right.
We learn this from the other Gospels, that Jesus actually appeared to his followers.
Yes.
And the Gospel of Mark implies that he would, but then some
Well,
people,
yes, that's going to be in today's scripture.
it is, but some later scribes appear to have added some stories about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances that were not in the original version of the Gospel of Mark.
Well, yeah, we're going to see that the angel says, go and tell his disciples he'll meet them in Galilee, which implies post-resurrection appearances happened.
There you will see him.
Right.
And we know from the other Gospels that, in fact, they did see him.
And we don't have the big, huge emphasis on the resurrection of Christ as we have it in the other Gospels, but it's certainly there.
The fact of the resurrection is affirmed here. Yeah. So,
now, what happened in the life of Christ then from the point where we stopped the story last week with the denial of Peter? Here it is. Late Thursday night, early Friday morning, the wee hours, in the dark hours of Friday morning, and that's where we stopped last week in the story. How does the story then continue?
Well, we saw Peter in the courtyard while the early hearings are beginning to take place. So there's a series of hearings before the Jewish high priest. And then we have trials before Pilate, a hearing before Herod Antipas, as you mentioned, and finally the declaration of Jesus' guilt and the order for his crucifixion.
Right, and Pilate seems to be very reluctant.
Very reluctant.
And that comes out in the other Gospels.
Pilate was a weak-willed leader, very wishy-washy. One minute...
And yet he was the longest surviving a procurator Roman procurator, I think about 10 years, by being wishy-washy.
Yes. One minute he'd be giving in to the Jews, the next minute he'd crucify thousands of them. So he was very unpredictable. And so here he wants to release Jesus, but gives in to the crowds and orders his crucifixion.
You aren't a friend of Caesar
Yeah.
unless you crucify this claimant to the throne.
Right. So then they hurry and bury him. He expired
3
about
o'clock.
3 in the afternoon.
Yes.
They need to get him buried before sunset because the Sabbath was beginning.
Yes.
So they hurriedly bury him in a tomb, probably in a cave-like tomb.
Yes.
And
That you could walk into.
and they would have quickly tried to prepare the body for burial. But as we begin our passage today, they've come back after the Sabbath is over, early on Sunday morning, the first day of the week, to complete the process of embalming as they did it. In their
Right,
custom. Yeah.
right. So that's where our scripture
Yeah.
takes up.
Well, you want to
Why
read
don't I
first?
read?
Mhm.
Beginning in chapter 16, verse 1, and reading through the end of the book of Mark as we think
As
it ended.
originally,
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
very good.
Funny ending.
It is. It's a very odd ending, and that's what has led many, many Christians to think that the gospel couldn't possibly have ended that way originally. But I think when we get to verse 8, we'll be able to talk about
Right.
some reasons why we think it's not only a possible ending, I think it's a brilliant ending.
Well, there are, just to finish that picture, we do have in later copies of Mark what we call the long ending and the short ending. Right. Now, my Revised Standard Version gives both endings in a footnote, which seems peculiar.
Some Bibles put them in brackets.
Yes.
Or double brackets after verse 8.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Who are these women? Let's talk about the women.
Yes.
We have 3 women mentioned here.
Mary Magdalene, and we think that Magdalene means the lady from Magdala. Now, where was Magdala?
That's a town, a very ancient Hebrew town, on the southwest side of the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, not too far from Tiberias.
Right. So up in Galilee, in other words, and Mary and a number of other women were longtime followers of Jesus. They were very early followers of Jesus. We meet some others in Luke chapter 8, where Mary Magdalene is mentioned, and another woman named Joanna, and one named Susanna. And then it says, and many others, and the word is in the feminine gender, so it means many other women followed Jesus day by day. And so here are some women who've been following Jesus for a long time.
That's an interesting thing to hear, that the women are seemingly very interested in the message of Jesus.
They are. And it would have been unusual. That would not have been considered very appropriate for women to follow a rabbi, say,
We're going to have
that
a
culture.
story coming up in a future week about a woman being in a very unusual place.
Yes, that's true.
And we'll say more about that when we get there.
So these are some female followers of Jesus. Now, I think it's very important.
Now, one thing we need to point out, let me interrupt you just a
Yeah.
second. Is Mary the mother of James and Salome?
No.
I tried to read it in such a way as to indicate there are actually three women here.
Yes. So the question is, are there two women here, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, or are there three women? And there are three women.
And how do you know that?
Because of the ending that's on Salome. It's one of the subjects of the verse.
Right. It can't be, it's not, to be technical, it's not in the genitive.
It's in the nominative.
Nominative.
So there are three women.
We have three women. Now, who is this Mary, the mother of James, and which James is it?
And we have no idea. We don't know which Mary this is, and we don't know which James this is.
They're both very common names.
Very, very common names. James is the name Jacob.
Jacob.
So, the patriarch Jacob.
In the Greek language,
and
yes.
Mary is related to Miriam.
Yes.
Moses' sister Miriam. Salome was also a fairly common name ever since Maccabean days. Salome appears to be the mother of James and John, two of the disciples, the sons of Zebedee.
The wife of Zebedee.
The wife of Zebedee, yeah.
Now, we don't know that for sure, do we?
No, not for sure.
But it could be.
It could well be. It's important that Mark tells us that they were bringing spices to anoint Jesus' body. And the reason that's important is they think they're coming to see a corpse. They don't expect Jesus to rise from the dead. Now you may say they should have, because Jesus prophesied
He talked about it.
He predicted his resurrection on
Yes.
multiple occasions.
Yes.
But they don't come, and I think that was important to the early Christians, because one of the charges that came from the lips of the doubters of the resurrection was that these early Christians were so expecting Jesus to rise from the dead that they just thought he did, whether he did or not.
Yes.
So it's important to point out they actually weren't expecting a resurrection.
Even some of the 12.
Exactly. So they think they're coming to find a corpse, and they've brought aromatic spices to further prepare his body for burial.
Because they didn't really have a technical embalming the way that we do.
And not the way the Egyptians did.
And you had to be buried the same day you died.
Very quickly, yeah.
Yes.
Then verse 2 and 3 tells us that the other thing that they don't expect to find an open tomb either.
Right.
They expect to find it sealed off by a stone which was rolled down a sloping trench into place in front of the cave opening. And so, much to their surprise, it has in fact been opened, which I think is one of Mark's ways of saying that a miracle has occurred here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because three women didn't expect to be able to push or roll this stone up its
Up
trench.
a ramp, yeah.
And then chalk it there so that it wouldn't roll down on them.
But it's already open. Now, the next verse...
By the way, it would be next to impossible to roll it up the trench from inside, wouldn't it?
That's true. You couldn't get a hold of the stone itself.
Yeah.
The next verse, verse 5, mentions a young man dressed in a white robe. What's your understanding of the identity of this young man?
Frequently, even in the Old Testament, angelic type beings are really referred to as humans. They have human appearance.
Okay, so, and other Gospels who tell this same story
We'll use the word
use
angel.
the term angel,
Yeah,
so we can
right.
assume that. Now they're alarmed because everything has gone contrary to expectation. They expected to find a corpse. They expected to find a closed tomb. In fact, it's open.
And the body
There is no corpse. It's gone. Instead, an angelic being is there. So we're not surprised that they're amazed and alarmed.
Now, is it fair to translate the verb alarmed?
Alarmed is fine.
Other translations have amazed.
I would say amazed, but alarmed is perfectly fine. Now, this angelic being knows why they're there. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene.
The man from Nazareth.
The man from Nazareth, like Mary was the woman from Magdala.
Yes.
And reaffirms his crucifixion, who was crucified. And we need to remember that that really is the main focus of Mark's gospel.
The crucifixion.
The crucifixion. It's not in his miracles that his messiahship is demonstrated.
Right.
It's in his sacrificial death.
Right.
Yeah.
Not to say that Mark questions the resurrection.
Oh, not at all.
Not at all.
He includes Jesus' 3 resurrection predictions, actually 4 resurrection predictions, and right here, an angel affirms that he is risen from the dead.
Right.
Yeah.
But the point is, too frequently, it's too easy for us to get to the resurrection and not pay much attention or put much effort into the crucifixion.
That's right.
And yet the crucifixion is every bit as important a part of the gospel as the resurrection.
You know,
they go together.
That is a good thing to reflect on. Here we have hurried from Palm Sunday to Easter, from the triumphal entry to the triumphal resurrection.
Yeah.
And it's easy to skip over the tragic events that
of the whole week.
Of the whole week.
Plus what happened on Friday.
Exactly. So we do need to pause. We don't rush on to Easter without pausing to remember the reality of the crucifixion.
Now, what about the wording, see the place where they laid him, but go? Comment on that, because I think it's very important.
I think it is too. The women are in shock. They're alarmed because everything has gone. They're surprised.
Yes.
And everything has gone counter to their expectations. And when you're in a state of shock or surprise or alarm, it has a kind of debilitating effect on you.
Yes.
It kind of freezes you up.
Yeah, what do we do?
What do we do now?
Yeah.
See, we knew what we were doing. We were going to anoint a body and mourn the death of
our friend.
The man we thought was the Messiah. So the young man in the tomb says, but, because this is contrary to all expectation.
So it's a very strong term.
On the contrary, because of what you have just experienced, you have a very important job to do.
Don't focus on this.
Yeah.
Focus on the other.
Right. And because these women are about to become the first preachers of the good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Right. And so that's why verse 7 is so important. On the contrary, go tell his disciples.
Refocus.
Yeah. Refocus your mission and refocus their mission by what you are going to report to them.
It looks like the death ends everything,
right?
But not so.
Now, what about the mention of Peter here in verse 7?
Yes. What are we to make of that?
Why single him out?
Well, I think it's obvious when we have such a long story that we looked at last time about his failure. He wanted to fight for Jesus, and Jesus says, put away the sword, and heals the servant of the high priest. And why? He's confused.
Yeah.
And he follows. The rest of them run away. We don't hear anything about them right now. But Peter goes slinking along in the dark just to see what's going to happen next.
Which is a kind of faithfulness and loyalty, but then when he gets there, he denies Jesus 3 times. So the last view we've had of Peter is weeping bitterly.
Failure.
Yeah.
Total failure.
Yeah, just weeping.
And depression.
Yeah. So he singles Peter out. He wants Peter to be sure to know that he has in fact risen from the dead.
We're going to salvage Peter.
Yes, and we're
from
going to
the
start.
wreck.
We're going to start the apostolic mission over again, back up in Galilee,
yes,
our home, and there they will actually see the risen Lord. Now we've got to spend a few minutes here at the end of our discussion on verse 8, because this is could be a kind of troubling verse.
Yeah,
it says,
it's confusing.
It is. The women are trembling. They're bewildered. They flee from the tomb.
They were afraid, is the last statement.
And they say nothing
and
to
that's
anyone.
Honest Fear.
That is the word for fear, yeah. And so people rightly raise the question, what's wrong with these women? They've just been told to go and tell, and yet they tell no one. And they've been sent out on a mission, but they're trembling in their boots or their sandals.
The sandals.
So afraid. And I think there are a couple of ways to read this verse in the light of the Gospel of Mark. For one thing, say nothing to anyone. Way back in the first chapter, when Jesus healed the leper, these are the exact words he said to the leper. Say nothing to anyone. But then he added, but go tell the priest that you've been healed.
Yeah.
And why would a leper tell the priest this?
Well, because that was procedure.
Okay.
And procedure for a leper is that when you have to go and be pronounced clean, and then you go through sacrifices and a ritual immersion.
And originally it was the priest who would have declared him unclean by virtue of his.
That's right.
So
we don't think of that as being normally a priestly job, but in that day it was.
Okay. So by going to tell the priest, you're telling the appropriate person who will understand the background.
And pronounce you clean.
And pronounce you clean.
Yes.
So when it says that the women said nothing to anyone, I'm convinced that what it means is they didn't go running through the streets of Jerusalem, waking people up that morning, saying Jesus has risen. Half the residents of Jerusalem don't even know who Jesus is, and the others don't have any background of expectation. Right. So I think they would have gone and told the appropriate people who did understand.
The apostles.
Namely the apostles.
The disciples.
The disciples.
Yes.
Right.
And that's what they're told by the young man / angel.
Yeah.
Go tell them.
And we know from the other Gospels that is exactly what they
did. Yeah. And in the long ending, and that's a part of the long ending. They go and tell them, and the disciples are as confused as the women were.
Right. Now, what about this fear? Is that an appropriate response or an inappropriate response on the part of the women?
Fear, what in the world has happened? This surpasses all of human experience. This is unique.
Yeah. I think it's very appropriate. I agree. If we don't stand in awe, amazement, even reverential fear.
And keep in mind that fear always implies reverence.
Yes.
In the Bible.
If we don't stand with reverential fear at the empty tomb, at the news of the risen Lord, there's something wrong with us. So I don't think there's anything in it. It's like the disciples, after the storm was stilled, they were afraid. And that's because they had just come into contact with a power even greater than the power of a storm, which makes us afraid.
Yes.
And now these women have come into a power even greater than the power of death, the power of life.
Yes.
And so I think their fear is very appropriate.
Now, I think the strange ending is a way of telling the reader and really putting the reader on the spot.
You're right.
How are you going to respond to this crucified guy who disappeared from that tomb, the empty tomb? How are you going to respond to it? You going to believe it or not?
Are you still looking for Jesus? Are you still telling others about your faith in the resurrection? It's the question that comes back to the reader, and that's us.
That's us, and that's our message this morning. What can we do in response to the empty tomb, the story of a crucified man who is not in the tomb? And they said that he is risen and he is Lord, he has ascended on high. And that's our message this morning on this Easter. We hope that you will come back and be with us next Sunday as we travel on in looking at the gospel account of faith. God bless you.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.